Tammy briefly is here as well.
Oh, all right.
Okay, so then hopefully everybody can see my screen right now that says Norwalk Industrial Zone Study, draft recommendations, March 3rd.
Looks good at my end. Yep.
Okay, great. So we'll just get started. I think the agenda for today is we're going to do a quick sort of overview of what we're calling defining industry, just to talk a little bit more. I don't think we've really had the opportunity up until now to really break down what industrial means within the context of the industrial zone study. And then we're going to get into our draft recommendations, talk about engagement and next steps, and then have open it up for conversation and feedback. So just, as an overview in the beginning, before we dive into the recommendations, we wanted to make sure we had the opportunity to talk about trends in 21st century industry, and really define what we mean by industrial. So that's both looking at 21st century trends as well as looking at industrial uses within the context of Norwalk's zoning. So, we're using a reference here that we've used before, which is the State of Urban Manufacturing National Report from the Urban Manufacturing Alliance. And there's just 2 points that we kind of want to emphasize about in what we mean by industry in the context of this study, which is one, that our goals here are to support employment and economic growth, understanding that industrial businesses and manufacturing businesses can be vital to creating vibrant neighborhoods. They contribute to placemaking as well as employment. And then also sort of maybe a misconception about the scale and the kind of, bad reputation that maybe industry of the 20th and 19th century had, which is, lots of toxic pollutants, really large scale development. I think here we're really thinking about how industry has changed in the 21st century. It's much more smaller and medium-sized businesses, and they tend not to be, we're not talking about, the noxious sort of polluting industries when we are talking about promoting industrial development in the context of Norwalk. So we just wanted to make sure that that was clear, because I think that based on some of our previous meeting with some of the survey results, it seemed that there may have been some sort of misconception about what we mean by industrial development.
It's worth pointing out too that in some places where we do this work, there's a decision not even to use the word industrial, but to use, manufacturing and distribution, which are different kinds of industrial businesses. So that might be a question for the group. Is industrial itself a little bit of a hard sell as a name? And maybe we come back to that as we go through some of the ideas we have for you.
Yeah, exactly. So, we'll dive into that content a little bit now when we're talking about the context of industrial zoning in Norwalk. Currently, within Norwalk's zoning ordinance, there are 3 industrial zoning districts. There's industrial zone 1, there's restricted industrial, and then there's light industrial. And here you can see that color coded in dark purple, light purple, and this kind of vibrant purple. But this is just trying to give you a sense of where those are located within the city. And there's a bigger area down in South Norwalk along MLK Drive, of course, along the waterfront in East Norwalk, and then some patches here on the Norden site, and then sort of smaller light industrial district on the west side of the city. So if we look at all of those industrial zones and read through the zoning to understand what are the actual industrial uses that are allowed within those zones, we get quite an extensive list, and it's important to sort of tease out what are the different uses within that list. So here's a long list of uses that are currently allowed within Norwalk's industrial zones. And so when we're talking about promoting industrial development, and again, the quote unquote industrial, we're calling that into question. We're looking at sort of manufacturing and processing, research and development, maybe to a lesser extent, but maybe to some extent in some sites over others, warehousing, storage, and wholesale distribution. These are uses that promote economic development, job creation. They support clean industry. Here you can see an image of, I know microgreens has come up quite a lot. These sort of like smaller scale, cleaner industries. Then there's sort of a chunk of uses that we understand to be necessary for the region, some of which may be well located, some of which may not be well located. I think something that comes up quite a lot is the issue of contractor yards. Also things like municipal sewage treatment facilities, things that are essential to the functioning of a region and a city, but have some sensitivity to abutting or adjacent uses. And then there's kind of this sort of accessory or the sort of other set of uses that currently accompany industrial uses that are not inherently industrial. So this might be offices or retail, artist workspaces, social services, and multifamily and single family housing.
Yeah, this is an important point because in a lot of your industrial districts, these uses are also allowed. And that's relatively unorthodox because typically the policy idea of an industrial district is to not allow other uses so that the land values are at a level that they actually work for industrial. And so in the Norwalk zoning code, there's both industrial uses allowed in non-industrial districts, and there are uses that are non-industrial allowed in industrial districts. And so that has become, as you'll see in a minute, one of the things we've been trying to sort out. It seems there's a lot of uses allowed in a lot of the districts in Norwalk.
Right. And
Can I ask a question? Can I just ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
So is that scenario a normal one, or one that you've seen, or is that past practices that most municipalities have done away with?
We'll get into
You'll discuss that.
That's our
Okay.
recommendation. I mean, I think
Okay, I'm sorry.
it's the crux of this, which is, and I maybe a little bit of framing of this so that people have a perspective on it. Land values are like the land values that drive what brokers tell property owners their parcel is worth on a per acre or per square foot basis, is typically driven by the highest and best use function that a broker thinks a developer might buy a parcel for. And the problem with allowing multifamily in an industrial district is that the land is typically priced for a hypothetical multifamily project and not for a new industrial business coming in. So this is the market reality, which is why we think it's important to kind of sort this out with you. So that's a little bit of a preview of the challenge of having too many uses that are allowed, if that makes sense. But again, we're going to get into that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes.
Yeah. So again, if we organize a lot of these uses across a different spectrum, we understand that industrial uses are not all the same. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see sort of smaller scale, less intensive uses. On the right-hand side, sort of larger scale, more intensive uses. And we've kind of, this is something that the city already sort of does in terms of defining manufacturing, but we've kind of done it for the purposes of, the study to really divide, again, understand boutique on one hand, light in the middle, and sort of heavy industrial uses on the right. And here you'll see listed sort of different types of uses that we're talking about within each of these categories. So within the boutique manufacturing category, you might have a ceramic studio, bakeries, artists' workspaces, sort of small scale manufacturing, sort of artisan workshops. Within the light industrial or light manufacturing category, you might have the same thing image that we brought up before, sort of microgreens growing, oyster processing, maybe sort of food and beverage production, smaller scale research and development. And then sort of heavy industrial uses is, I think, maybe the sort of signifier that most people attach to the word industrial. And here you see the Divine Brothers site, which is, more intensive concrete production, oil storage, that type of thing. So this is actually a more limited,
Right.
use that happens within the city.
Maggie, if you could go back to 2 slides back or 3 slides back to the kind of gradient between kinds of industrial uses. What's important here relative to that question about different districts having different uses, if you think about it, boutique uses would work well in a mixed use neighborhood that includes residential too. So all of those uses, that first set of pictures that Maggie had, would be fine in a kind of urban mixed use neighborhood that had housing and commercial, because those uses have low impact and might even appeal to those local residents, those neighbors, because it adds to the kind of vibe and the lifestyle of a neighborhood. Light industrial is compatible with other commercial uses, but typically not not residential uses. And then heavy wants to be on its own. It's not even really compatible with you know, an office building or a hotel or that kind of thing. So sorting these out these ways is a lens by which we can think about in the Norwalk zoning districts, which kind of uses belong in which kind of district. And again, the zoning code does address that through definitions that already exist. But we think there might be a way to simplify it and clarify it, not just for zoning, but also for economic development.
Okay, so that gets us to exactly what Tim is saying, which is our first draft recommendation, which is to simplify industrial zoning to reflect current industrial uses on the ground, as well as 21st century trends and sort of desired uses. Again, we just want to throw this map again to revisit the fact that Norwalk has 3 industrial zones. But again, if we look at the zoning and where uses are allowed, industrial uses are actually allowed in many of the zones within the city. So if they're industrial uses, as we've just described them in those 3 broad categories, boutique, light, and heavy, are allowed in some form in all of these districts that you can see. So these are mostly most of the non-residential districts. And then on top of that, the discussion about multifamily development is a really important one. Here in the striped hatch, you can see where multifamily development is allowed by right. And that happens to be in a lot of the same areas where some of these industrial uses are allowed. So because the market prefers multifamily development, oftentimes what that means for industrial development is that it kind of crowds out or encroaches on sort of viable industrial sites that might be useful for job creation, and where some of these light manufacturing uses can even take place. So there's a limited number of areas where that can actually happen, and we want to make sure that multifamily is not crowding out those opportunities. So we've created this chart, which is a little bit complicated, but it's basically looking at all of those different existing zones that Norwalk has currently that allow some sort of manufacturing or industrial use. So on the left-hand side, you see industrial 1, restricted industrial and light industrial, which are the city's industrial zones, and then marine commercial, business 1 and business 2, central business district, and neighborhood business, which are actually commercial zones that allow in some form of industrial use or manufacturing use. So we've listed here in this row all of those different uses, and then we've also identified whether multifamily was allowed either by special permit or by right. And we've tried to simplify all of this to say that we can actually code heavy industrial versus light industrial uses versus the artisan or boutique manufacturing uses in this sort of dark purple, light purple, and pink. And then to understand how multifamily will play into that. So we're going to show you that in a couple of slides that have maps on them, but this is to say that our initial recommendation is to simplify the zoning into 3 major zones: industrial, mixed use commercial industrial, which would allow for both mixed use commercial and industrial, and then mixed use residential commercial industrial, which would allow for more of that smaller scale boutique manufacturing to happen on the ground floor.
And just a couple of points that we've made earlier. You could change industrial to manufacturing if that is, a better term relative to the spirit of this. And you'll also notice that in terms of the use that drives land value to the most, that's always the first one. So that's why commercial is before industrial. If office pencils out, it's going to demand higher land values than industrial, unless it's Amazon, I guess, looking for a site. And then that's why we put residential, commercial, industrial. We put residential first for the same reasons I mentioned before. But all of your, except for I-1, all of the rest of those districts across the rest of that chart really very broadly fall into the mixed use commercial industrial or the mixed use residential commercial industrial, which we think is a a clear way to message really the spirit of those districts, which are no longer single-use districts, even under the current zoning anyway.
Yeah, and so we just look at how that plays out on the map, the zoning map of the city. You can see there are those three zones mapped onto sort of most of these commercial corridors or non-residential districts. You have sort of the darkest industrial zone is actually just around where the current heavier industrial uses already exist. That's mainly the where the working waterfront is on the north side of the river, as well as the wastewater treatment plant that functions for the whole city. The pink area is that mixed-use residential, commercial, industrial district, which kind of represents the urban core that we were just talking about. That's kind of the CBD, parts of South Norwalk and East Norwalk. And then the light purple represents that mixed-use commercial industrial district. That's happening both in South Norwalk as well as along some of the main transportation corridors of the city, sort of US 1, US 7. So then we also wanted to make sure that we identified within this simplified zoning map where multifamily development is actually allowed. So it's obviously allowed by the name of the district in the mixed use residential commercial industrial district, which is the pink area here, again, the urban core. And then we're saying that our recommendation here is to allow multifamily by special permit on these sort of light pink mixed commercial industrial districts. So these are areas that are currently occupied by sort of big box retail. They're along the sort of, what the view is along US 1 and along Main Avenue, Main Street. So we don't really want to incentivize more multifamily development in those areas because we want to sort of densify the urban core. So that's kind of a reasoning why we have it as right now identified as multifamily by special permit as opposed to by right.
Yeah, and just to be clear, this is a rough cut.
Yeah.
Like taking all of the analysis we've done and said, what's the clearest economic development and policy story that comes out of your recent citywide plan and messages more clearly where you would prefer different kinds of development. Again, commercial tax base along old Route 7 and Route 1, a true kind of urban mixed use where the pink is, allow special permit housing along the Route 1 corridors and old Route 7, but not in South Norwalk. And just, which was a little bit of a kind of conceptual breakthrough for us because we've been so deep into the weeds of the zoning that we thought that maybe it would be good for everyone if we tried to simplify this, at least as a framework for next steps for the city, if not, an immediately actionable zoning change, but at least as a way to message what you can do in these zones.
And again, this is sort of our initial recommendation based on our analysis, but I think definitely something that we want to engage you with in discussion and feedback about. So based on that simplified zoning, our second draft recommendation is that within the mixed-use residential, commercial, industrial districts, incentivize ground floor boutique manufacturing and live work spaces through height bonuses. So this is something that's that's pretty consistent with the two neighborhood plans that already exist, the Wall Street West Avenue neighborhood and the East Norwalk TOD. In both of those plans, there is a desire for, incentivizing boutique manufacturing on the ground floor and allowing for these types of, innovation spaces. And so we've looked at those two specific areas. First, within the Central Business District, just as an initial recommendation here, there's sort of these remnant I-1 zones on the north side of that district. Our recommendation is to absorb those within the Central Business District. And then within the zoning of the Central Business District, currently there is there are a number of bonuses, amenity bonuses, so that if you provide certain amenities, you get a height bonus. And we're recommending adding ground floor manufacturing as an amenity bonus, so that you might be able to build to a higher, if you provide a certain minimum percentage of ground floor manufacturing space.
And I just want to point out that if there's full follow through on this, this district name would be changed to the mixed use residential commercial industrial district, just to, because we're reverting back to existing zoning terminology here.
Yeah, exactly. And then same here with East Norwalk. Right now, there's two main zones in this neighborhood that we're paying attention to. One is the neighborhood business, which is shown in pink, and the purple is the industrial zone 1. We want to distinguish, the industrial zone 1, which is on the waterfront, which you can see in this map is the wastewater treatment plant. And then the rest of the what's in purple now, which is currently zoned as I1, and we think would be more appropriate for this mixed use residential commercial industrial district. And that following some of the changes that are, within the East Norwalk TOD, to allow a building height increase for ground floor manufacturing uses. I think our initial proposal is 6 stories without a height limit on properties that are larger than 1 acre. But this is also, again, very much up for discussion, something that we're just taking an initial sort of stab at, and that we should, continue to discuss what that height bonus wants to be. But I think the main takeaway is that these purple areas definitely want to be distinct from the I1 zone that's on the waterfront. Okay, so then our third draft recommendation is to upzone within the mixed use commercial industrial zone to accommodate hybrid industrial commercial building types. So going back to that simplified zoning map again, we just want to sort of identify where we're talking about in where we're talking about where this mixed use commercial industrial zone would exist. Generally along MLK Drive and South Norwalk, where Woodward, Wilson, and Meadow, that kind of confluence of roads, along US 1 on the east and west sides, as well as along the sort of main avenue, and maybe more concentrated in the Muller Park Perry Avenue area. And so here's just aerial views of those sites that we were just mentioning.
Yeah, and I think if you can go back to the map for a second, Maggie, I think again what we're recommending in those areas where multifamily is allowed now, which is again along Route 1 and what I still call old Route 7, we would switch as of right multifamily to multifamily by special permit. We think that would tamp down market speculation and would allow the city and the planning board to make smarter decisions about where to allow multifamily in those districts, especially in those districts where there are currently commercial and industrial businesses that contribute to the tax base. And so we also have an eye on, at a broad conceptual level, of helping the city and this committee realize that the preservation of commercial and industrial taxable property, I'm sure, is one of the city goals next. And these are aerial views of what those particular districts that might be vulnerable to multifamily look like, which is they're little pockets of commercial and industrial activity that have grown up over time. They're kind of legacy businesses, and so they're good places for new mixed-use commercial and industrial development to actually happen. As soon as you open the barn door for residential, it would probably tip development interest in a very different direction. What we're proposing in these districts, in addition to either an industrial project or a commercial project, development project, because both actually exist in these areas that I'm showing you, is a zoning code that allows for a hybrid to be built next. And this is something that we've worked on recently in a couple of other kind of industrial district projects. I think it jibes very well with the Connecticut economy and even the Norwalk economy, where you are allowed to put commercial office space above high bay industrial space on the ground floor. That works well for medical device manufacturers. It works well for kind of life science R&D. And it's a way for the city to maybe incentivize the next generation of high bay industrial space to get built. Because a lot of the existing industrial building stock is probably from the 60s and 70s, and it's probably nearing the end of its life. And so the best way to incentivize that is to allow enough upper floor office space that the cross subsidy from the value of that office space actually allows the industrial rents to be at a level that it can match market demand in the region. And so because you can build up to 85 feet with a relatively inexpensive construction type before you get into more expensive commercial building construction classifications, we find if you set a height limit at 85 feet, you can do a high bay space with 28-foot high industrial space on the ground floor, and then market typical floor-to-floor heights for office space above. And so the reason for that is to incentivize redevelopment in some of these areas, like the ones I had on the previous slide, to get an intensification of commercial development to actually happen. And so this is a picture of what a building like that would look like with a kind of high bay ground floor space. A bigger ground floor that includes the truck loading bays on the back, and then the floor plates that make more sense for office space above. We even worked out a structural grid that would allow a transfer and the structural support from the warehouse space up to the office space. Next. Sorry, my wife's having a competing meeting here. I don't know if you can hear or not. These are some examples of mixed-use industrial commercial buildings. An example in Portland, Oregon, the Brooklyn Navy Yard is a place where a lot of these are being built now because of the relatively higher land values in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And then the repurposing of an old Navy facility in Boston into what's a kind of mixed use, kind of bespoke manufacturing office building. Some of these are taller than what we're talking about. The one on the left, the one on the right, the one in the middle is just 3 stories tall, but the scale we're talking about is somewhere between these. Next. So the other thing that everybody should realize is that the number of commercial floors you could build above a new industrial space is going to be completely dictated by the size of the parcel. Like anything else, and people on the planning board know, and people at the city, parking is often the tail that wags the dog. And that's especially true with these kinds of buildings because it's not feasible to put parking below grade or put it into a kind of ground floor podium. And so here's a parcel that's almost 2 acres. You can see that working out some market metrics, you can only get a floor of commercial above to get the parking to fit and to get a line of parking bays. We did these test fits to understand what the impact of parking would be. This is even with a reduction in parking for industrial to 1 space per 1,600 square feet, which is the new kind of conservative progressive number that we've been using in a lot of our zoning work. Next. If you go to a parcel that's 2.6 acres, you can get 2 floors to work, balancing out the access for the trucks and the parking. Next. And you'd really need to get to 3 acres before you could really get closer to that 85 feet. But we still think it's worth, as a zoning code recommendation, to go up to 85 feet because that might make the market pay attention and look at some of the sites that only have 1-story buildings on them now. So, but again, those are for those existing kind of commercial industrial districts, mostly that are kind of hidden in a couple of places in Norwalk, which is typically near Route 7 near some exits of Route 7. A lot of that development happened because of the promise of Super 7 that never went all the way to Danbury. So that's why a lot of those businesses got established there in the first place, because in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of talk about Route 7 going further north than Wilton.
Tim, question, clarification. To the extent we're making changes like this in the zoning regulations, I mean, how likely are we to inspire property owners to bring lawsuits against the city regarding these changes that they may feel are literally costing them money?
Yeah,
Or-
I think the only recommendation we're making that might be a risk is to convert as of right multifamily to special permit. Everything else that we're proposing is a density increase, which really is a positive outcome for parcel owners, and doesn't put them at risk for non-conforming uses, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
And we've had some discussions with Steve about that. He thought we should propose removing as of right multifamily from the corridors and making it a special permit. But we haven't had a long discussion with the city about what the implications might be in terms of reception, potential, legal questions about that, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know, Steve, if you want to weigh in about that.
Sure. So I think two things. One, on the legal aspect, and I'm not an attorney, but I would say that, is so long as whatever is being proposed is consistent with the plan, and then, if necessary, you would go back and amend the citywide plan to reflect that, then, you have the kind of leeway to amend the regulations as you see fit. I think you would probably be very safe from litigation on those fronts. Something else just to kind of keep in mind, there's some new housing legislation that's being proposed for the state that I haven't talked to anybody really in depth about this yet, but there's proposals to require what's called missing middle housing, which is kind of like 2 to 4 units that they want that within, and I have to go back and look whether it's a quarter mile or half mile of all commercial centers. So that's got broad implications for the Route 1 corridor specifically, because that's not always the case in certain areas. So we'd have to maybe keep that in mind as we're kind of finalizing some of these recommendations.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that we talked about internally, Steve, partly in response to some of your comments over the last couple of days, is that change from as of right to special permit might not be in those full stretches of, the old Route 7 corridor and Route 1, but might be more in alignment with where the existing commercial industrial areas are, right? I think the other thing is that from an economic development standpoint, if you could go back to whatever the last map we had, Maggie, because I think this is an important kind of policy point, the kind of our proposed zoning map. Yeah, this is a good one, which is if you think about the market and where you'd want to steer multifamily or even the missing middle relative to city policy and transportation and walkability, if you could wave a magic wand and steer multifamily and 4-unit developers somewhere, you'd want them to go to the mixed use residential, commercial, industrial areas, because even though Route 1 is a commercial corridor, it's still sprawl. It's still a lifestyle where people are getting in their car, unless they happen to be next to a CVS or a Trader Joe's or something, and they're doing everything they're going to do. So, I think it's the policy that Steve's talking about, which is consistent and almost parallel to the same policy that was enacted by Massachusetts very recently, would like the pink areas the best in terms of the spirit of that policy. Just to add some more comments about that. But I think the question about, the only place where we're taking away the something that you can do now would be to convert those areas that are outlined from, in many cases, from as of right to special permit. Back to that question. Okay, sorry, Maggie, we got totally
No, that's a
sidetracked
good
here.
discussion to have. I think the multifamily question is something that will continue to come up. So just to summarize what Tim was saying about the 85-foot high sort of hybrid commercial industrial building type, I think that this is the sort of the recommendation as it would fall within both our proposed zoning and within, showing what the existing zoning is, that 5 stories at 85 feet could apply to the mixed use commercial industrial as well as the industrial zones, which generally track with these zones that you see here where I'm mousing over.
And that might get because there's some, neighboring contextual reasons why the existing heights are all over the place from 55 and 50 to 35. There might be 2 versions of that. It might be, 3 or 4 stories at X and then 5 stories at 85 as we zero and understand what the urban form impacts would be of that. But from an economic development and a kind of incentivizing commercial and development standpoint, that would be good. And by the way, that 85 feet would only be allowed for the hybrid buildings, not a pure office building, because the idea is that that would incentivize developers to build industrial space to get the extra height. So we'd have to look at recommendations that would have, a lower, maybe we'd be allowed to do a 5-story commercial building, but the height without the industrial would be lower. And partly that's because industrial space needs to be high. It needs to be 30 or 31 feet floor to floor, because contemporary manufacturing and distribution space is only viable when you have a 28-foot clear ceiling. And that has to do with forklifts and racks and the way that distribution, even of manufacturing, works now. So that's why you have to allow more heights if you're going to have these uses on the ground floor.
So that we're going to move into our 4th recommendation. Now we can go back and talk about that at the end, but I think this is a major one that we wanted to make sure to talk about, which is distinguishing contractor yards from other industrial uses that we've been talking about up until now, and identify more suitable locations and sites for them. Currently within Norwalk zoning ordinance, contractor yards are permitted by right only in industrial zone 1. I know there's a moratorium going on right now, but they're also permitted by special permit in business zones 1 and 2. So this is kind of a map that shows, where contractor yards could go, mostly in this stripe zone, which is obviously where we find a lot of the contractor yards, and then by special permit in these zones outlined in the darker line. So we just wanted to take a moment to sort of address what some of the challenges are with contractor yards currently, especially in the South Norwalk neighborhoods. There are a lot of those heavier industrial or heavier, more intensive uses that we talked about that require maybe larger trucks like semis, as well as more frequent truck activity, maybe noise. And that's all happening in areas where, the roads are conflicting with uses. So on Boughton Street in particular, you have this intensive truck traffic happening on narrow residential roads. The road network here sort of supports this kind of patchy situation where you've got industrial uses nestled next to multifamily and also residential uses. And then you have sort of intersections that cause conflict and produce more truck traffic. So on the upper right-hand corner, you can see what is the confluence of South Main Street and Wilson Avenue, as well as Meadow Street. And it's kind of this very skimpy intersection to accommodate all of the trucks moving in and out there, as well as the very narrow 25-foot right-of-way on Boughton Street, and then sort of the fencing you can see here along some of these larger site contractor yards. Another thing that we wanted to point out was that not all contractor yards are the same. I think some of the more intensive ones are those that are using a lot of, or that are more earth moving and site materials or site storage materials. And that might be, we might want to distinguish that from other types of contractors that might have smaller operations or less intensive operations on the ground, such as plumbing or electrical contractors. So I guess the major part of this recommendation is really thinking about where else besides in South Norwalk contractor yards could go. And that's taking into consideration, truck access as well as buffering from residential neighborhoods. So we kind of highlighted 3 areas where we think we want to open up for discussion, that we might allow contractor yards to go as of right rather than by special permit. And one of those areas is along US 1, between US 1 and I-95, which is pretty well buffered area because they have the 2 major transit corridors, as well as easy truck traffic onto 95. And this is currently occupied by a lot of sort of big box retail, and is currently zoned as business zone 1.
Maybe Maggie, some on the committee are like, that's the craziest idea I've ever heard. But here's a way to think about it, which is big box retail is going to be, was vulnerable before COVID, vulnerable after, and ultimately in the long term, those are good sites for commercial office, especially commercial office where companies want to put a logo on their building to get, that's why it's a very popular location for retail too. But to allow contractor yards to go there as a kind of market holding pattern while the market figures out the highest and best uses for those sites might not be a bad strategy for 2 reasons. One is that it's away from other residential areas, so it doesn't really have an adverse impact on residential areas the way some of the contractor yards do now. It's a sign that those uses are being more equitably located in different parts of the city. And those are the 2 reasons we thought it was worth putting on the table. That except for the fact that the city would probably like to see higher and better uses there. Those are not good sites for residential, by the way. We don't think in the long term. That's why we're proposing it as an idea, because one of our internal discussions was in conjunction with better enforcement, let's share the wealth a little bit more, and try to get these in more than one place in the city as a way to kind of unconcentrate them. So those are the reasons. We don't think that the long-term future of Norwalk is to have contractor yards there.
Yeah, and I would say the unconcentrating part is important because where we've designated for contractor yards to be unconcentrated, they're in better locations. I think currently as they are in South Norwalk, because of those issues that we just explained, intersections, the size of the roads, the road networks, the adjacency to residential areas, those all create the conflicts that have made contractor yards locations very difficult. But I think we've not only this zone, but I think we're also looking at other areas within the city that have those sort of buffering factors already built into them that would allow for fewer of those conflicts possibly. So these are the 2 other districts or 2 other areas that we're thinking about along MLK Drive, which is again buffered on the one side by elevation and topography. There's kind of that large, change in grade, as well as by some of the, as well as by the larger industrial parcels there, and then possibly also within Muller Industrial Park, which is along US 7. And then this is, again, in addition to sort of expanding where contractor yards can be located, I think that recommendation goes hand in hand with improving code enforcement as well as design guidelines. Currently, this is the sort of definition of contractor storage yards, and there are some requirements about setback lines as well as the height of stockpiles and screening. But I think that with in addition to more or better code enforcement, I think being a little bit more specific about what those buffering guidelines might be will help for these conflicts to not be so intense. And then the final recommendation that we have is looking at, two very special sites that are both in the Norden site and the Waterfront site, and we're recommending that these two areas be looked at more on more of a case-by-case basis, and developing separate plans for them. So first, with the Norden site, I think we just want to acknowledge some of the points or some of the analysis that we've developed relative to the Norden site. One is obviously it's one of the largest parcels in Norwalk. It's around 37 acres. So that represents a huge potential for redevelopment, but at the same time, that is in conflict with truck access and sort of adjacency, again, to residential areas. This red line represents the main sort of artery currently to and from the Norden site to get onto I-95. And so that Strawberry Hill Ave kind of cuts right through this residential zone. So any sort of large industrial user that might use the Norden site, if it has heavy truck traffic or semi-traffic, would really have to think about how to provide direct access onto I-95. And that comes with sort of CONDOT regulations about how any sort of ramp would be built or limited access road would be built. So that's one consideration.
I think just something else about the ramp idea is that it might be impossible to actually get to work because unless that company would be happy that it could only accommodate an off ramp for east traveling trucks and then an on ramp to go east again, you still to head westbound or into New York City, you still have to take Strawberry Ave to go in at least one direction, because I don't think there's enough either city or state land on the opposite side to do an overpass to also have an off ramp for westbound traffic or an on ramp. So while it's a good idea conceptually, I don't think the real estate's there to actually make it happen. We're working with the city of Beverly, Massachusetts on a similar concept, but in that case, the grading works a little bit more in the favor in that location, and the city actually owns enough land on both sides that at least it's conceptually possible to do. So I just wanted to talk about the kind of physical and spatial challenges of actually having a separate exit and entrance there.
Right. And so an additional consideration, given the challenges and limitations of providing an additional exit, sort of other suitable land uses might include industrial commercial that doesn't have such intense truck traffic or doesn't require that type of direct access onto I-95. So vehicles that are just passenger vehicle traffic to and from the site through Strawberry Hill Avenue that wouldn't be any more intensive than what currently exists. So that could be biotech, that could be sort of other industrial commercial uses. So those are just some points that we wanted to highlight about the Norden site, but obviously it's its own sort of animal that is not, similar to any other place within the city. So we do think that it requires sort of a separate study or separate plan. And the second sort of special site, it's not really a site, but is the entire Norwalk River and the waterfront. And so I think that, again, the waterfront represents a sort of diversity of uses. These are all, this map here shows the different zoning districts that are on the waterfront, as well as the different types of businesses that are on the waterfront. And so it's a lot about negotiating the diversity of uses here, updating the harbor management plan, and understanding, waterfront access and maintaining waterfront access, given all of these different sorts of developments that might happen along the river. So again, we think that is a separate study, that it's not just looking at an industrial zone study is not going to accomplish sort of the holistic vision that might be required for the broader Norwalk River waterfront.
And Steve, I think you had mentioned to us before, if you go back a slide, Maggie, the previous slide, the last time the city did a harbor management plan?
A long time ago.
Okay. Yeah. So long time ago. And so I think coming out of all of the things we've learned on the industrial study, and even pointing in the direction with some of these diagrams that Lisa worked on, uh, the timing might be good to tackle this.
So that kind of summarizes the 3 draft recommendations that, or sorry, not 3, I don't know why I said 3, 5 draft recommendations that we have up until now. Maybe we take a moment, Steve, to sort of talk about engagement before we can open it up for a broader discussion.
Sure.
Yeah, so we have highlighted sort of 2 major aspects of engagement, and Steve can elaborate on this. We were thinking that initially we would do follow-up with some of the industrial businesses and industrial owners that we interviewed as part of the initial engagement of this study, and then to expand on that with 3 more focused neighborhood-based outreach sessions. And I think that's something that will definitely work with the city to identify the appropriate areas and how those sessions want to be carried out.
Yeah, I was thinking, this is just my initial thought and figured I would bounce it off the rest of the group, was that, with the 3 neighborhood approaches, to me, there's 3 definitely distinct areas, and maybe you could argue there's 4, but I think there's 3. One would be like the Perry Avenue area. It's a little less unified in terms of like a neighborhood association. And the commercial users, I am told, have been difficult to reach out to in the past, but I think maybe a meeting focused on things that could happen in that area and what they're seeing, what they want, and what could happen would be appropriate. Same thing with East Norwalk. I know we just went through a pretty extensive planning study in that area, but then that group is easier to engage, definitely much more active. So we could have a separate session there, and then have obviously the bigger area is South Norwalk. So we could take a look at, all the aspects of the things that Maggie and Tim were going over in terms of, obviously the trucks are going to be a big issue. The contractor yards are going to be an issue. How to, protect the neighbors. So I think we could do definitely a South Norwalk meeting would definitely, be a large meeting, and I think would get a lot of interest, but I wanted to get the feedback from the rest of the group on what they thought about those steps.
Steve, who would you envision meeting with? The property owners, the operators on the property, or a combination of the 2?
I think you would open it up. I think, so as Maggie indicated, the team would reach out to some of the folks they've already spoken to and say, here's kind of our initial recommendations, what you think. Obviously, there'll be refinement based on the feedback from this group, but have those conversations to get their input. And obviously, if they want to attend the broader meeting with who I would think would be the interested parties in the neighborhood, would be residents, business owners, anybody interested in the area, anybody, commission members, whomever.
Is there an idea, Steve and Sabrina, about the best way to get the word out to make sure that property owners as well as kind of neighborhood reps and advocates came to that meeting too?
I would say for sure from the business perspective to reach out to the chamber. That's definitely one big piece of it. For the MLK corridor study that we did, we went through the faith-based institutions in South Norwalk. They have a good reach, and a lot of folks that live in the neighborhood obviously also attend those faith-based kind of institutional church days or whatever it is. So they're pretty engaged on that front. Darlene can comment probably a little bit more on her district on where to post the information, but the library is also a good resource. They have a great email list that's pretty comprehensive. And definitely we can include it in the city's briefing and things like that as well for those meetings. But I definitely think a major key is going to be the faith-based institutions, the housing authority as well, and definitely the Chamber of Commerce and the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce too.
I think too, we could also, and I'd probably have maybe get some help from either the chamber and or Sabrina on that, but identifying all the businesses in the areas we're talking about and trying to find a contact information, whether it's an email address or somebody. And then if we have a flyer for the meetings, email out the flyer to them and provide our contact information. Hopefully we can get a few people to attend on that basis.
Yeah, and I think that it's important that property owners come to the meeting who might have an interest in what future zoning changes might mean for them in terms of perceptions of land value or, you know, those things. I mean, maybe we reach out to the real estate community too, the kind of the commercial brokers in town or in Fairfield County to, it's in a way almost a kind of market that Norwalk is open for business too a little bit. I mean, not to get out over our skis here, but they're often thoughtful commentators on these kinds of efforts.
I have the ear of a lot of the real estate community, as you could imagine. But also the chamber has a lot of contacts that are real estate agent based, and a lot of them are connected to the, I think it's like the national chapter of realtors or something along those lines that operates in Fairfield County.
Probably NAOP, right? There's a Fairfield County NAOP.
Yeah, so
yeah.
we've engaged with them a few times as well on other things where they have questions for us about kind of what's going on. So engaging them, we can also do something like that for sure.
Does anybody else in the commission have any thoughts about outreach beyond what we're talking about here? Going once, going twice.
Steve, I just like thinking ahead to the next version of this presentation, you know, especially if, you know, there's going to be some kind of more kind of immediate regional folks that are going to be looking in on this. I think there's a double story about Norwalk's, you know, role as the kind of hub of Fairfield County, or one kind of hub, and the story that probably doesn't play well politically is that it's where things like contractor yards go to, you know, service, you know, bespoke home construction, you know, from Darien sweeping around to Westport. That's one story. But the other story is all of those businesses that Maggie included on the slide, especially for the kind of bespoke manufacturing, that because of the purchasing power of the county, that kind of manufacturing, kind of fabrication, small scale shops are well positioned in Norwalk relative to the customer base of Fairfield County. And so we might need to work with Kevin about, along with the slides Maggie put together about those categories of manufacturing, some observational piece about, as a kind of positive economic development story, how Norwalk is already capitalizing and can continue to capitalize on that. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I think we might need a kind of master narrative, even on top of those uses that Maggie talked about, to a kind of wide Norwalk piece. I don't know, we can think about that, Steve, but it's just something I'm thinking of as we're thinking about potential audiences, because I wanted to be very pro Norwalk too, so that the people of Norwalk thinks this is, you know, a good idea.
Yeah, and this is not directly related, but when you were talking about the changes in the I-1 zone to allow the you know, the buildings that are really needed for that kind of operation today, do you have information that, you know, related to the demand for those kind of, you know, I mean, just don't want to rezone something just based on the recommendation in the plan. Hopefully it's based on, we're seeing, you know, anecdotally, you're seeing this kind of need and demand in many areas and why it would fit here.
Yeah, we can put something together on that. I mean, I think we've worked with Kevin before to look at other indicators, Etsy, businesses in certain, certain areas and that kind of thing. But I would say that based on the planning work we're doing in other places, these are precisely the kind of cities that are able to capitalize on it. Cities that are surrounded by other communities with consumers, but surrounded by communities where you can't really have those kinds of businesses because of building stock or 2-acre zoning or whatever the issues are. So I don't know, Kevin, if you're still here or not, but if you have any ideas about how we might frame this a little bit.
Yeah, Steve, the question when you're talking about the market, are you talking about these kind of bespoke type manufacturing, or are you just talking about the manufacturing and distribution in general?
I think it would be both. I think
Okay.
to justify changing the zoning, or so, it's A, is how realistic is this for the city to obtain, and B, what are the benefits if we did go in that direction?
Right.
I would also ask for Sabrina's opinion on this, since she's the one that often gets these calls.
That's often a better answer, a better source than data-based, actually.
Yes. So just so everybody on the call knows, me and Maggie have had multitudes of conversations offline before you guys see any of this information. So we've talked about all of the recommendations and had conversations about them at this point. And I've echoed kind of the ease that's needed for people looking for property, people looking for places to locate. That's the first part of it. Then the second part of it is really leaning more on kind of what Kevin's role in all of this is, which is where does the market fit in, and the calls that I get, how does that fit in? Because the calls that I'm getting for industrial space at this point are between 10,000 and 25,000 square feet. They don't have a lot of employees, but they're specialty makers. They're printers, they're, computer chip makers, they're those types of things. And green energy has been a big pop-up as of late as well. And the thing is, they need the larger space, but if somebody's building a brand new space, they're going to charge more rent than some old factory building that they could pay for outfit. So it's a balancing act between having space readily available in the city, which at this point we don't, which changing the zoning and doing the recommendations that they've come up with will help with, but it's also making sure there's a price point that's going to end up making sense for folks to actually move in.
Yeah,
So,
and that's the idea of commercial on top. That helps to
Yeah.
cross subsidize the rent on the ground floor, and that compatibility for some businesses actually makes sense. Like a chip maker might take a floor of that space upstairs and then have fabrication on the ground floor. But I think it might be useful, Sabrina, if you could work with Maggie to just capture some of the market trends that you see with some bullets we could have on a slide. The kinds of businesses that have reached out to you, the size of space they're looking for. And then that might also be something that Kevin can pivot off of to do some follow-up research. But,
Yeah.
being in Fairfield County on I-95, kind of locational advantages near New York, near customers, that's if they're coming to Sabrina, that's already a choice they've made versus being further out or in Danbury or other places. So there's already the fact that these requests are coming in, because in any case, you're going to be paying more in Norwalk than a lot of other kind of
Yes.
places in the region, already means there's locational advantages in Norwalk, just in terms of that. And also, I suppose the kind of the occupancy of existing commercial and industrial space in the city too. That's an indicator that might suggest that there's a supply problem. So those are some data points I suppose we could look at.
Steve, the short answer, yes. I think we're going to have to do it for a couple of reasons. One is I think if this market looks anything like any of the other markets we're working in right now, my guess is most of the industrial pressure is probably distribution related. And so getting ahead of that curve is probably something that's important. And then I think second is what is working with Sabrina about what she's seen from a lead stream perspective. And I think the third thing, which is as we talked about in our prior internal meeting, is a couple of weeks ago I was traveling and there was some really interesting kind of maker spaces, and I think there's some things that need to be done. The city's going to need to do if they want some of the boutique manufacturing ideas that you have that's kind of already on the books to have a chance to take off, but also look at some of this market research to also help kind of sell the idea to some property owners and developers who may not think it's real, but we have a bunch of examples where there's some really interesting hybrids going on, which will allow you to do some of the things you're trying to get done in that district as well. So I think we'll put all that stuff together.
I'm going to need to leave. So there are two comments that aren't necessarily related to this particular item, but I'd like to get them on the table. One is just political on the drawing you showed of those areas. You showed where the garbage dump is. I don't think we ought to use that term. It's actually a recycling center. I mean, just
Yeah, so true.
Stood out as inappropriate.
I wonder if that was on a map or something. I don't think we made that up. We must have gotten it off of.
That may well be.
Yeah.
The second had to do with contractor yards. This idea of equity makes a lot of sense if we can move some of these contractor yards out of South Norwalk, which has absorbed over the years way too many of them. But I think if we're hoping that we set some property aside between the 95 and the Route 1 corridor, that they're going to move, I'm not sure that that's realistic. And I think that the only result will be the proliferation of the number of contractor yards in the city of Norwalk. And I don't think that's a good thing. And it does absolutely nothing for South Norwalk. So I think you need to give that a little bit more thought.
Yeah, I agree. And we threw it out there. I don't think it's on the top of our list of our favorite recommendations. I mean, the other tool really is to upzone where the contractor yards are and have the market, in a way, hopefully take care of them, and then in the meantime, amp up enforcement and maybe even create new design guidelines that require more screening. But I think we generally agree with you. It might attract other businesses into the city, but why would, unless the land values are high enough in South Norwalk for them to move, why would they move?
Exactly. Plus, to some extent, that Route 1 corridor is a gateway into the city of Norwalk, and I don't think you'll want a bunch of contractor yards as the gateway. With that, I apologize for leaving early, and at the same time, thank you for scheduling this earlier so I could attend. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Kim, I had a couple question and a comment. I think one thing before people get into a panic, we went through a pretty exhaustive analysis and planning process as part of East Norwalk TOD plan. I think going above the height that's permitted right now in the Industrial 1 corridor that parallels the railroad tracks, I think would be problematic there. So if there's maybe that's in the more on the boutique side of things, given the parcel size, that might make more sense anyway. Just want to throw that out there because I'm sure I'll get some calls.
Where is that, Steve, in particular?
East Norwalk and along the railroad tracks.
I think that might need to be. I think that might need to be looked at carefully, like within the context of East Norwalk for sure. And I think that 85 foot or like higher building height suggestion is kind of just, you know, a broader suggestion across the board. But I think what Tim was saying earlier about like zooming into some of these areas and thinking more about context and abutting heights and just making sure that everything is not overblown is definitely a phase that we'll need to get into.
It's interesting that you said that, Steve, because, you know, we've been hashing through this stuff with you internally over the last week or so, and in my most recent discussion with Maggie, which wasn't that long ago, I'm like, well, maybe on the west side of East Norwalk, because that zone she was showing is in two pieces, right? One's closer to the station and one's closer to, you know, what should probably just stay industrial. That maybe if you can pull that slide up, Maggie. You know, that as you get closer to the river, maybe it's more sustainable, but certainly, you know, on the east side of that area, that height wouldn't make any sense at all because you're abutting residential uses and that kind of thing. So I think you're right, Steve. We're gonna have to modulate those heights and think about the consequences of them. Totally agree with that.
And one thing, and Maggie and I had a conversation earlier today, and the idea of amenity points in general. I know that the existing regulations have, right through there, have the structure built in for allowing amenities and requiring amenities. What's your general experience and thoughts on amenity bonuses versus other ways to incentivize those kind of things that you want?
I think, you know, it's a discussion we had earlier with you, Steve, and I think with Sabrina, that, you know, there's two routes that you can go here, I think, generally from a policy standpoint. And this is outside of bids and other kind of financing incentives. This is just purely baked into to land use regulations. You can either, above a certain size parcel, require some percentage or size of bespoke manufacturing, which would be the bespoke manufacturing equivalent of what a lot of cities require to have retail on the ground floor. It's a kind of 21st century version, which is, you know, if that's a policy objective in some areas versus, you know, active edge retail, it would function the same way. And so, but the risk there is, what if there aren't enough tenants to fill those spaces? The same question with ground floor retail now, by the way. You know, a lot of cities require ground floor retail in certain districts, and, you know, it's the same issue. They're not filled for a while because, you know, retail is going through a crisis now. Or you allow for a meaningful enough bonus that if a developer is incentivized that they want that extra density, they actually do the hard work to go out to find that tenant as part of their original, you know, development concept phase. And so I think, based on our discussions, it's probably a better way to go. I think it, you know, we have to make sure that the bonus is more than just the square footage of doing the thing that the bonus is for, because then there is no incentive. But I think it could work in Norwalk. We'll have to think about the language and the terms very carefully, though. You know, it's back to Sabrina's point that people are looking for space between, did you say 10 and 25,000 square feet, Sabrina?
Yeah, that's what they're
Yeah.
about lately.
You know, is there, for the bespoke stuff, would people do a business in 3,000 to 5,000 square feet? Maybe, you know, if it's a more craft oriented business, it might be possible. And, you know, I think in a targeted area where it makes sense, I would say it's worth the policy risk, because the market isn't going to respond to that unless they think they can fill that space anyway.
And I can bring up kind of an example. So I just placed Reed Fasano fabrics into the Martha Stewart building that's kind of on the line of Norwalk and Westport, but it's in Norwalk. If this kind of space was available at the time, that he was looking, he would have jumped all over it. The amount of money he had to put in to make the space that he's currently in what he wanted would have made the rent perfect for him in that location. The only problem with putting him on the ground floor as of right now, when we were originally looking, is that none of the ground floor space in the CBD had high enough ceilings to accommodate his equipment, because he has high ceilings that he needs for his printers to print on his fabric. So not that it wouldn't have conflicted with residential use, any of those things, but none of the spaces ceilings just could get his machinery in and then actually be able to function within it. So
yeah, and I think there's a really interesting policy idea here, which is once you're at 15,000 square feet and up, people want 28-foot high ceilings. I think for some to the trade wholesale businesses that maybe have a kind of customer face, this is certainly true in the to the trade furniture business and that kind of thing. You don't need 28 feet clear, you need 16 or 17 feet clear. So, we might include to the trade businesses with showrooms in this category too, to open up a little bit more of the options, which tends to be a use that you find that's allowed in these kinds of bespoke manufacturing districts. It's kind of, and that seems like Sabrina's story, like very Fairfield County, kind of to the trade businesses that tend to be in industrial districts otherwise. They always have a kind of customer face, a kind of showroom window anyway. And so I don't know, Kevin, if that makes sense to you or not.
No, it makes total sense to me.
Is there anybody else from I know we have, I want to give the public a few minutes at the end to comment on anything they've heard or questions. Anybody else on the committee who hasn't said anything? There've been several quiet people, so I wanted to throw it out there to get impressions from everybody else. Silence, not sure if that's good or bad.
Hey, Steve, John Coyotes, how are you? Real quick question. We mentioned the waterfront and the Norden Park is going to be dealt with in a separate study. I mean, Steve, do you have a plan in place for that separate study? So I know that's areas which obviously are important and of high value to many people.
Yeah, for each one of those is, obviously completely distinct. Norden itself, I'd be optimistic, I should say optimistic, hopeful that the market would also step in with some of the same thoughts that we're thinking about. So I don't know if it makes sense for the city to take that on. I think helping market it, and then when issues come up on like how to get an off ramp and the limited access highway to that site, how we can help in that regard, I think would be probably our biggest benefit on that. The waterfront, that was something that we've just started talking about in the last month or so, about the more this gets looked at, the more it's kind of its own unique entity and needs to get looked at separately. So that's something I think over the next probably next couple of months I'll start working on or thinking about a work program for that. And then it might be a budget item next year, unless I can find some grant money. I do have a new planner coming on board in a couple of weeks who's got a lot of waterfront experience. So we'll have a chat with her about that and see what she thinks and then how to tackle that.
I think that just to parse that out a little bit, Steve, I think for the Norden site, we're going to give you some general recommendations in this plan, like don't have heavy truck dependent uses there. We think it's a better site for office, commercial, or life science than residential, although residential is there. So we'll tee up enough recommendations that even as an internal discussion that you have, at least the consultant team's kind of general observations and advice are there as general guideposts. The waterfront, it's in a very small area, you have the world's most complex waterfront. So it's hard for us just with a bulleted list to, be super directive there, except that you've got some water access points that need to be thought about. We could kind of do a kind of proto scope of the issues the plan should attack, but less clear from a kind of direction and recommendation standpoint, we don't have a ton of opinions about that, even looking at it like all this time.
Well, can I, just one thing is, I mean, I hate to have overlapping plans. Like an area of high priority for me is the harbor side of Water Street, and coming up with a plan for that. But obviously we have further down the harbor that would obviously be looked at as well. So I guess I'm saying if we're going to attack this in a separate plan, I mean, would those two areas fall within the same plan and make the same recommendations? And I just don't want to, double up on efforts and have it go
No,
to none.
I think it would be a singular plan. But the recommendations for the different, like the upper part of the harbor versus the lower part might be completely different. There might be some unifying themes within the two and this came up in it seems like every plan we do, the one theme is trying to get as much public access as possible. But obviously, if you think about like Divine, for example, or even the chemical site down there closer to the highway, getting public access along the water there's a whole other host of issues that come into play in terms of site security, public safety, and so forth. So we need to really consider those things very carefully.
Okay, so you're saying that plan, that's going to be a separate plan down the road, hopefully depending on grant or the city investment.
Yeah, and it's definitely something we probably need to sit down with the Harbor Management Commission and talk to them about. The citywide plan does recommend that they update the harbor management plan, so maybe it's
Tied to that. Yeah, I would tie it to that, Steve. I think, and just take the kind of area and the colored map that Maggie has up as a kind of the study area.
Okay. Well, other than that, I think I'm impressed with your knowledge of Norwalk, and I think we're on the right path. So thank you, everyone.
I don't know if Darlene or Dick have any comments. Tammy was on. I'm not sure if she said she was having connection issues, so I'm not sure if she's still on.
I really don't have any comments. I think this was a good presentation. I'm really looking forward to the second round of community meetings. I think will just help us move forward with this plan. I was interested though in knowing, were you all able to get a number of on how many contractor yards there were in South Norwalk?
Are you talking legal ones or illegal ones or both?
All of them, legal.
I think we have that number somewhere. I can ask somebody.
Okay. Thank you for your time and all the effort you put into this. So
We do know Norwalk very well now, right, gang?
oh, yeah.
Oh yeah.
If nothing else, I see Diane Lorcella has her hand raised. So I'm going to give her a couple minutes, and then anybody else who's on the call, I see another hand raise. Just a couple minutes, and because it's getting close to the end, but we wanted to give you a little bit of time to ask questions or make a comment. Okay, Diane, you should be able to go ahead.
Thank you. On this call, can you see me on the camera, or it is not?
No, hold on a sec. I couldn't.
I mean, that's okay. I actually am having.
I promoted her panelist, so hopefully she's still. Hopefully, I didn't lose her.
Usually
Okay,
when they do that, they sign her back in. Yeah.
Yes, thank you as a panelist, but I'm still having a bad hair day, so I'm going to keep my video off. You hear me?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I was very much looking forward to this interim report, and I'm really enjoyed much of what was said. And I was wondering whether the slides will be available on the city website for those of us to take a look at them at some point in the near future. But there were some takeaway points. I have had long-term, both professional and altruistic interest in an industrial zone rehab and reform. So the first thing is, what I'm concerned about is the timing related to when the Norden site and the waterfront sites will get around to having plans. So I encourage this committee to take a look at having at least some baseline policies, because I am worried about what may come in to Norden before we get around to the next phase of the industrial zone study. I know that we're having a zoning regulation study, and many people are worried about what's going to come in. So possibility of having moratoriums on Norden would be terrific if we could manage that before a new permit comes in, because they will come in. I am very interested, of course, as Darlene knows, in the contractor yard issue. So on the issue of the number of legal ones that are proper with the current zone, I feel that the trend should be for the illegal ones, that those have to remove themselves. That we do not, before Steve got here, there was a habit with the zoning staff and some of your predecessors to actually cause the illegal contractor yards to become legal with planting buffers and the like. I say they're illegal. They should be removed from the surface of the earth, because that is part of the big problem in South Norwalk right now. I'm very pleased that there was a slide on the different types of contractor yards. I think that was terrific, because a lot of folks don't know what that means. And we must get this right this time, because some of the heavy duty contractor yards include piles of sand, which are carcinogenic, and they're in South Norwalk. And there are, I agree with Mr. Love mentioned enforcement hiding. There has to be a component of enforcement starting yesterday that will help. And I'm very pleased that there are some on Wednesdays, you do have an attorney helping look at some of the violations, but I do think you need more than the staff that you have, because there are so many violations throughout the city, but especially in South Norwalk. So please consider, I have to look in and see whether I would love to know and get a list from you, Steve, or your staff, where are the illegal contractor yards throughout Norwalk, and especially in South Norwalk. I hope that we are not trying to help them stay there. They should never have been allowed to be there in the first place. So I have to check. I hope that the habit or the policy of your predecessors is not still occurring. Secondly, and I'll be quick, related to brownfields. When Redevelopment Agency had a short-term brownfields task force, I was on that task force because of my professional background as a former hazardous waste regulator. And I wanted to make sure that we at least have some thought about identifying where the current existing brownfields are. Many have been cleaned up, which is a good thing, so we can put them into good use. But there are others that are still especially in East Norwalk near the sewage treatment plant, that need to have something happen so they could be put back into useful taxing life. The other thing is related to the harbor management and the harbor side. I was one of the first harbor management commissioners when Bill Collins was mayor, way back in the 80s, a long time ago. I wanted to know if you could also add a layer or a lens related to how climate change and sea level rise may impact the development stages of the waterside and harbor area. That is because there is sea level rise predicted, and it has taken, of course, such a long time to see what we're going to do as far as development on Divine Brothers, King Industries, etc., ONG, that we need to know the impact of climate change, realizing that you can engineer away anything. You could make anything by lifting it up off the ground, but do we want to do that as opposed to retreat or as opposed to adaptation? So lastly, I just wanted to say thank you so much. I hope to talk with Sabrina about a couple of clean industrial ideas. I really, of course, want us to think about clean industry and to also align where people can walk to that work, take the train to that work, and use the pedestrian and biking lanes to that work in Norwalk. I think that would make for a wonderful, very vibrant city. So thank you.
Okay, and we do have, just an FYI, we do have all the sea level rise indications from Connecticut Deep already mapped. It's in the citywide plan. We also put that in the East Norwalk plan. So if anybody hasn't seen that, we do have that available.
It's also mapped on this map that Maggie has up.
Good.
Just as an FYI, we were curious too. So just letting Diane know that we were taking a look at that as we were kind of teeing up the issues that the waterfront / harbor management plan should look at and tackle.
I see, I think one more hand up. It looks like Scott, you can unmute yourself if you have some comments.
Too many screens open, sorry. Hey, this was a really interesting presentation. I just had a question regarding timing and next steps coming out of this, because I definitely got the next steps component of engaging the community, but was unclear about what the timing on that might be. And then it sounded like the next step was to revise the plan based on that community engagement. So just trying to get a sense of when that would be.
That's a good question. Yeah, we didn't really talk about that. I was thinking about that when we were saying that. I was like, we didn't really say when that would happen. Let me, maybe Maggie and I need to chat offline. Definitely want to do it not too late, because I'm optimistic that as soon as school's out, everybody will be vaccinated and can start vacationing all over the countryside. So maybe we definitely want to do that public part of it in the not too distant future to try to get a captive audience, which we have. And then, whether there's another meeting of this group before that time, based on the discussion today or not, we haven't settled on that yet either. But hopefully in the next week or so, we can start looking at dates for those meetings.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that our team would like to keep up the momentum because we have all of Norwalk in our head, and I'm worried if we, wait too long, some of it will leak out. So we're juggling a lot of ideas here, and so I think Steve, I think Maggie and Kevin and Lisa and I would appreciate, at your pace, but we can speak more passionately and more off the cuff about this when we have all of the kind of data points of all of the ideas we have in our head too. So
yeah, so the only question on my end, really, we'd have to find a date. We could, to me, sometime maybe late April. I don't know if that's too late, but okay, I don't know if this group wants to circle back one more time before we have that.
I think that will be the critical question from a scheduling vantage point. I think it won't be, based on our discussion today, I think it shouldn't take us too much time to revise and incorporate some of the comments that we've heard and to refine this presentation and to sort of include some of those additional components that we talked about for a broader audience. I guess it will be a question whether we want to meet with the steering committee once before we start to go out into the outreach sessions.
My recommendation, if the steering committee is okay with it, is to come back to the steering committee after we do that outreach to help us sort through the feedback we got, actually, because I think, I generally think plans come together the best if partly because we heard mostly encouraging things today, which is to throw the balls in the air, have the different stakeholders weigh in, and then huddle with the steering committee again to say, we heard this, this, and this. What's meaningful to this plan? What's actually feedback that's actually about something else? And so that's one way we could go, but it's really up to the steering committee and you, Steve.
Yeah, and what we could do also is we can work on scheduling the meetings, and if we need to have another meeting in the interim, we just schedule that. That's fine too.
Right.
I would agree with Tim. I think going out to the public at this point is a good idea. I think I'm pretty comfortable with what we have here, and I think getting the input at this point before we get too far down a road would be the best, and sorting through all that comment together and then seeing what we would change from that point on is good. So
Okay, so I mean, I can work with you guys on looking at dates and how we want to structure it, and I'll probably have to reach out to folks here. I'm assuming, like Darlene and John, what you think about, like, probably an evening meeting makes the most sense. I mean, we could always figure something out. One thing we did when I forgot which study it was now, that we did one daytime meeting and one evening meeting. So we could always circle back, and, like, if we end up doing like in the three geographic areas, having those individual meetings, and then if we need to do a daytime presentation for anybody else, just do one for the whole group. We could always do something like that. So assuming Maggie and everybody's willing to jump on that.
Yeah,
I'm okay with that. Yeah, that sounds good.
We've also, to handle both the time frame issue and the targeted neighborhood thing, is that you could have those meetings at different times of the day, target those neighborhoods, but also communicate that they're open to the public too if they can't happen to come to the one that's in their neighborhood, right? Because the content's going to be pretty much the same, and so you can do a kind of both and, right? But we'll follow your lead, and Maggie will follow up Steve to figure out what's best.
Yeah, Steve, maybe we'll just have a conversation internally just to talk about how to best approach the scheduling and who's contacting who and when to arrange those things. But
Yeah,
that general flow of things makes a lot of sense to me.
Good. Okay. Yeah, we can work on that. I just, by the time we get a flyer together and put some dates on the calendar, making sure there's no conflicts with, other city meetings, budget meetings that are kind of in full swing at the moment. So we'll definitely be able to come up with some dates. Okay. I think unless anybody has anything else, we could probably adjourn. Nope. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for participating. Thanks for taking an hour and a half or
Thank
so.
you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thanks for your feedback.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.